The day Walter Langston buried his conscience was the same day he watched Cornelius Hale get driven off his land at gunpoint. And for 5 long years afterward, he carried that burial like a stone lodged somewhere beneath his ribs, heavy and permanent, and entirely of his own making. It was the spring of 1878 when it happened, out on the flat golden stretches of the Texas Panhandle, where the grass ran waist-high, and the sky pressed down so enormous and blue, it made a man feel both small and chosen at the same time. Walter had been 24 years old, lean and sun-darkened, working as a ranch hand for Silas Drummond, who owned more land in Colton County than any one man had rightful claim to. But rightful claim was a notion that did not much trouble Silas Drummond, and therein lay the problem that would define the rest of Walter Langston's life. Cornelius Hale had filed his homestead claim in good faith with the land office in Amarillo. He had the papers, properly stamped and signed, giving him 160 acres along the Sweetwater Creek, where the soil was dark and fertile, and water ran clear even in the driest months of July. He had built a modest 2-room house with his own hands, planked a small barn, and planted the beginnings of what he intended to be a wheat farm. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with a quiet dignity that came from a man who had worked hard all his life and expected nothing but fairness in return. He had a wife named Clara and a daughter named Hazel, who was 17 years old that spring, and who sat on the porch steps with her dark hair pinned back and her amber eyes watching everything with a steadiness that seemed too old for her face. Walter had ridden out with Drummond's men that morning under the pretense of checking fence lines. He had not known, or had told himself he had not known, what the morning would bring. When they arrived at the Hale homestead, Drummond himself rode at the front with his attorney, a pale, slick-haired man named Gorton, who carried a document that he claimed superseded the Hale family's claim by virtue of a prior survey. It was a fabrication, and everyone present knew it was a fabrication, but the law in Colton County bent in whatever direction Silas Drummond pointed it. Cornelius Hale had come out onto his porch with quiet resolve. He spoke calmly, said he had his papers from the land office, said this was his property and he would not be moved from it. Drummond had listened with the patient contempt of a man who has never once been told no by anyone who mattered, and then he had nodded to his men, and 2 of them had laid hands on Cornelius, while Gorton the attorney waved his fabricated survey like it was scripture. Walter had sat his horse 30 yards back. He had watched every single moment of it. He had watched Clara Hale scream from the doorway, and Cornelius get his arm wrenched behind his back, and the papers he was holding get torn from his hand and scattered in the morning wind. He had watched young Hazel stand up from those porch steps with her fists clenched at her sides and her jaw set like iron, staring at every one of Drummond's men with those amber eyes burning, and something in Walter had shifted and lurched inside his chest, like a door that wanted to open but found it had been nailed shut. He had said nothing. He told himself later that there was nothing he could have done. He told himself the words that cowardly men always tell themselves, that it would have made no difference, that Drummond was too powerful, that speaking would have cost him his employment, his livelihood, the small savings he was building toward a future of his own. The rationalizations were thorough and they were practiced, and they were, in the end, entirely hollow. The Hales were put off their land that day. Clara and Cornelius took what belongings they could carry in the back of a borrowed wagon and moved on, drifting eventually to the town of Millhaven, 30 miles east, where Cornelius found work at a feed store and Clara took in laundry. Hazel went with them, of course, 17 years old and dispossessed of the only home she had known. Drummond absorbed the Hale acreage into his growing empire without a second thought. The house stood empty for a season and then was torn down for lumber, and the wheat seedlings Cornelius had planted were plowed under, and the land became indistinguishable from the thousands of other acres Drummond had swallowed up over the years. Walter Langston stayed on with Drummond's outfit for another 18 months, and every one of those days weighed on him in ways he could not articulate to anyone. He was not by nature a dishonest man, which was precisely what made the dishonesty he'd committed by silence so corrosive. He quit Drummond's employ in the fall of 1879, giving no reason, and drifted north to the Oklahoma Territory, where he hired himself out to a cattle operation run by a decent man named Abbott. And he worked hard and kept mostly to himself, and tried to think as little as possible about a morning in the spring of 1878 when he had sat his horse and watched an injustice happen and done absolutely nothing to stop it. 5 years passed in that fashion. He was not unhappy exactly, but he was not whole either. He built a reputation as a reliable hand, honest in his work if not entirely honest with himself, good with horses, steady in rough weather, the kind of man other men trusted on a trail drive because he never complained and never shirked. He saved his money carefully, and eventually, in the spring of 1883, he had enough to put a deposit on a small parcel of land in Colton County, ironically not far from the land the Hales had once worked, which by then had passed through 2 more transactions as Drummond's fortunes declined following a disastrous winter that wiped out much of his cattle herd. He came back to Colton County in April of 1883, 29 years old, with enough money to start building something of his own, a cattle and farming operation on 60 acres with good grass and creek access. He engaged a contractor in Millhaven to help him raise a small house and set about the work of establishing himself. He told himself that starting over here, building something honest on honest ground, was a kind of restitution, even though he knew that restitution without action was merely another form of self-deception. It was in Millhaven that he first saw Hazel Hale again. He almost did not recognize her. 5 years had transformed her from the young woman with the iron jaw on those porch steps into something that stopped the breath in his throat. She was 22 now, tall and straight-shouldered, with the same dark hair worn up more elegantly, the same amber eyes that he had never quite managed to forget no matter how many miles of trail he'd put between himself and that morning in 1878. She was behind the counter of the general store, the one her father now partly managed after years of working there, weighing flour into brown paper parcels with efficient and capable hands, talking to a woman customer with a warm directness that was entirely her own. Walter stood in the doorway of the store with his hat in his hands and felt the stone beneath his ribs shift and press harder than it had in years. He went in. He bought a coil of rope and a box of nails and a paper of tobacco he didn't particularly need, and Hazel helped him at the counter with professional courtesy and no recognition whatsoever, which was both a relief and a peculiar disappointment. Why should she have recognized him? He had been one of a dozen men on horseback on a morning 5 years ago, a face at the back of the crowd. She had been looking at all of them, but at none of them individually, her gaze burning across the whole group with equal heat. He thanked her and went out into the Millhaven afternoon with his purchases, and he sat in his wagon for a long moment before he picked up the reins, looking at the front of the store where through the window he could see Hazel moving efficiently behind the counter, her dark head dipping as she wrote something in the ledger. He drove home and told himself to stay away from her. He had no right to complicate her life. He had wronged her family in the most passive of possible ways, which was still a wrong, and approaching her was self-serving. So he stayed away for 3 weeks. He built fence posts. He laid the foundation of his small house alongside the contractor he'd engaged. He rode to Millhaven only when necessary and always went to the other store at the north end of town for his supplies. He saw her twice more in passing, once crossing the street in a blue dress that the afternoon light seemed particularly interested in, and once standing outside the church speaking with the minister's wife, laughing at something that caused her whole face to open up and made Walter's hands tighten on his horse's reins with the involuntary grip of a man who is struggling with something he cannot name. It was the laughter that undid his resolve to stay away. Not because it was merely pretty, but because it was full. It was the laugh of a person who had survived something hard and had not let it sour her, and that combination of survival and warmth was so exactly the opposite of what Walter had become in 5 years of tight-lipped expiation that he felt it like a physical ache. The following Saturday, he went into the general store with a list of genuine supplies and made no attempt to choose a different counter. Hazel was there, and she served him with the same efficient courtesy, and Walter, who had been quiet and contained for 5 years to the point where speech sometimes felt foreign to him, surprised himself by saying, after she had handed him his change, "I wonder if you would allow me to know your name, miss." She looked at him with those amber eyes in a way that was measuring and clear. "Hazel Hale," she said. "And yours?" "Walter Langston." He watched for recognition and saw none. "You're the one building out on the Sweetwater Creek parcel," she said, and it was not a question because Millhaven was a small town and people talked. 60 acres. "That's right." "It's good land," she said, with a neutrality that he couldn't quite read, and he wondered for a startled moment whether she knew something, whether she had made the geographic connection, before he realized she simply knew the country well, which of course she did. She had spent her childhood in sight of that creek. "I think so too," he said, and then, because he had learned very little about graceful social navigation in 5 years of working cattle, he said, "I'd be glad of your company sometime, Miss Hale, if that's something you'd consider." She studied him for a moment that stretched long enough to make him acutely aware of his own heartbeat. "I consider things carefully," she said at last, "but I don't refuse things simply because they're unexpected." She said it with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Come to the church picnic on Sunday. I'll be there." He came to the church picnic on Sunday. He wore his best shirt, which was not particularly best, and he combed his dark hair, and he arrived at the churchyard with a bottle of cider he'd purchased at the store on the north end of town, which he realized belatedly would have been better purchased at the Hale's store, but it was too late to do anything about that. Hazel was already there when he arrived, standing with a group of women her age, and she saw him come through the gate, and there was that slight lift at the corner of her mouth again, and she excused herself from her companions and came toward him across the grass with the direct, unhurried stride of a woman who moves through the world on her own terms. "You came," she said. "I said I would. Plenty of men say things they don't follow through on." She said it without bitterness, just as a statement of observed fact. "I try not to be that kind of man," he said, and felt the irony of it settle into him like a blade. They walked together through the churchyard picnic that afternoon, talking about the land and the season and the price of wheat, and he discovered that she had a quick and particular intelligence, the kind that had been formed by paying close attention to the world rather than by formal education, though she'd had some of that too. 2 years at a school in Amarillo where her mother had insisted she be sent when she was 19. She had strong opinions about farming practices and equally strong opinions about the dishonesty of certain commodity brokers she had observed operating in Millhaven, and she delivered all of these opinions with a frankness that he found entirely refreshing after 5 years of his own practiced silence. He discovered that her father Cornelius was still alive, still working at the store, aging but stubborn in the way of men who have been knocked down and refuse to stay there. Her mother Clara had died 2 years prior of a fever that moved through Millhaven in the autumn of 1881, and the grief of it still lived in Hazel's face in a quiet way, visible mostly when she thought no one was watching. Walter listened to all of this with an attention so complete it was almost reverent, and Hazel noticed. "You listen differently than most men," she said, near the end of the afternoon when they were sitting on a bench near the churchyard fence and the picnic was winding down around them. "How so?" "Like you're actually hearing what's being said, not just waiting for a pause to speak." "I spent a long time saying very little," he said, which was as close to the truth as he had come with anyone in 5 years. "I suppose it made me better at the other half of conversation." She looked at him with a thoughtfulness that made him feel seen in a way that was not entirely comfortable but was, he realized, precisely what he had been missing. "What were you doing all that time when you said very little?" she asked. "Working cattle, mostly, in the Oklahoma Territory." He hesitated. "Thinking about things I should have done differently." "That's a considerable occupation," she said without mockery. "It is," he agreed. They parted at the gate when the afternoon light had gone golden and long, and Walter walked to where his horse was tied, feeling simultaneously lighter and more burdened than he had in years. Lighter because she was extraordinary and she had spoken to him as though he might be worth speaking to, and more burdened because the more real she became to him, the more real his silence on that morning 5 years ago also became. He came to the store twice more in the following week with legitimate purposes, and each time they talked a little longer than the transaction required. And by the second visit, Hazel had dropped the formal courtesy and was speaking to him with the directness she seemed to reserve for people she had decided were genuine. He met her father briefly on the third visit, Cornelius Hale behind the back counter, sorting a shipment of dry goods. Older than Walter remembered him from that terrible morning, but still broad-shouldered, still with that quiet dignity that hit Walter somewhere behind the sternum like a closed fist. He shook Cornelius Hale's hand and looked the man in the eye and managed to hold his expression steady, though it cost him something to do it. On the following Thursday evening, he called at the small house where Hazel and her father lived, at the decent hour of 6 o'clock, and asked if he might take Hazel for a walk, which was the acceptable fashion in which these things were done, and Cornelius looked him over with the calm scrutiny of a father who had learned to judge men carefully, and gave his consent with a nod that seemed genuine. They walked along the main street of Millhaven in the warm May evening, and Hazel told him about her ambitions, which were substantial. She wanted to help her father secure a larger share of the store's ownership from the current proprietor, a man named Fletch who was aging and had no family, and had been making noises about selling for some time. She wanted to see more women in Millhaven running their own enterprises, because she had observed that women who depended entirely on men's decisions were perpetually vulnerable to those decisions going wrong. She said this last part without looking at him, and Walter heard in it the history of a morning in 1878 that she had never directly spoken of. "You lost land once," he said carefully. She stopped walking. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "My father filed a proper homestead claim. We had the papers from the land office in Amarillo. We were forced off by Silas Drummond, and an attorney with a document that everyone in the county knew was fraudulent." She said it clearly and without flinching, 5 years of digested grief giving the words a clean, hard edge. "My father tried to pursue it through the courts, and was told the case had no merit, which was Drummond's money speaking through the judge's mouth." "I'm sorry," Walter said, and the inadequacy of the two words fell between them like a stone into deep water. "It isn't your fault," she said, beginning to walk again. The words landed on him like a brand. He did not correct her. He did not tell her the truth. He walked beside her through the warm evening and listened to the sound of Millhaven at dusk, and carried his silence like the stone it had always been, and he despised himself freshly and completely for it. He called on her again the following week, and the week after that, and as May moved into June, what was happening between them took on the shape and the weight of something real. He brought her wildflowers he'd picked from the creek bank on his property, which made her look at them with a softness that briefly rearranged her entire face. He made her laugh twice in a single afternoon, which felt like a greater accomplishment than anything he'd done in 5 years of cattle work. He sat on her father's front porch in the evenings and drank coffee, and talked with Cornelius about farming and weather, and the changes coming to the Panhandle as more settlers arrived. and the old man began to warm to him in the gradual way that decent men warm to other men they are cautiously deciding to respect. And through all of it, the stone under Walter's ribs grew heavier rather than lighter, because with every passing week it became clearer that what he felt for Hazel Hale was not a passing admiration or the simple loneliness of a man who had been alone too long. It was specific and complete, and unlike anything he had known before. It was the recognition of a person who matched him in all the ways that mattered and exceeded him in several, and the more he knew it, the more impossible it became to ignore the fact that it was built on a concealed foundation. He was building a future with a woman whose past he had silently participated in destroying. Not as the architect of the destruction, not as Drummond or Gorton the attorney with their fabricated document, but as one of the men on horseback who had watched it happen and said nothing, which was a different kind of participation and no less real. In July of 1883, on a hot, breathless evening when the prairie grass stood still in the airless heat, Walter took Hazel out to his property for the first time. The small house was nearly finished, standing solid and honest at the edge of the creek, and the late sun hit its new wood with a warmth that made it look like something more than lumber, made it look like a promise being kept. Hazel walked through the empty rooms with her hands trailing along the walls, and she stopped at the window that looked out over the creek and stood there looking at the water for a long moment. "This is good land," she said again, as she had in the store that first day. "It was homesteaded by a family named Hale in 1878, he said, and his voice came out careful and deliberate because he had decided in the wagon on the way out there that he would begin to approach the edge of the truth even if he could not yet bring himself to speak the whole of it. She turned from the window. Her expression shifted in a complex way. "I know," she said quietly. "My father filed on it. 2 years before I was born, he came out here from Tennessee looking for a place to start fresh." She paused. "This was our beginning. We had 60 days of living here before Drummond came." "I know," Walter said, and the words came out of him with a weight that made her look at him sharply. "How would you know that?" she asked. The July evening pressed around them. A mourning dove called somewhere out by the creek. Walter looked at the woman he was falling in love with and felt the full consequence of 5 years of silence converging on this single moment. And he was not ready. He was not ready to lose her, which he knew was the most selfish of reasons to continue keeping the secret, and yet there it was. "Word travels in cattle country," he said, which was not exactly a lie but was not anywhere close to the truth. "I heard the Hale name when I was working in Oklahoma." She looked at him a moment longer than was comfortable, and he thought she might press further, but she turned back to the window and the creek. "Well," she said quietly, "it's good land. Whoever tends it deserves to see it flourish." He drove her home that evening in a silence that was warm and mutually understood, as silences between people who are becoming close to each other can be, and he held her hand briefly when he helped her down from the wagon, and she did not pull it away immediately, and the warmth of her hand in his was both the best thing he had felt in years and the sharpest reminder of what he was failing to tell her. 2 more weeks passed. He proposed taking her to a dance in Millhaven the following Saturday, which was the 4th of July celebration and the biggest social event the town mounted in the summer. She said yes, with a directness that made his heart work harder than usual. He picked her up at 6 that Saturday evening, and she was wearing a cream-colored dress with green ribbon trim that he had not seen before, and her dark hair was down and pinned differently than usual. And when she came out the door of her father's house, and he saw her standing in the warm July evening light, something in him simply and completely surrendered. He told her she was beautiful, which men said to women in 1883 with a formality that nonetheless carried genuine weight when said sincerely. And it was so sincerely said that Hazel Hale, who was not a woman easily flustered, looked momentarily flustered and then recovered herself and told him he looked very well himself, which he did. The Millhaven 4th of July dance was held in the large barn belonging to the Cleary family on the south edge of town, which was cleared of all its usual contents and strung with lanterns that threw warm orange light across a crowd of 200 people. There was a fiddle player named Macready who had been playing dances in Colton County for 20 years, and 2 guitar players who backed him, and the music they made was the kind that moved through the feet without asking permission from the brain. Walter danced with Hazel 3 times, which was the number that was considered proper before the whispers of something serious began circulating, and then danced with her a 4th time because the fiddle launched into a reel, and she was already laughing and reaching for his hand, and he did not have the capacity to refuse her anything when she was laughing. Between dances, they stood at the edge of the floor with cups of lemonade that Hazel's friend, a round-faced, cheerful woman named Pearl Simmons, had pressed on them, and they talked about everything and nothing in the way that people talk when they are happy and present and not thinking about anything difficult. And Walter thought that this was what it felt like to be a whole person, and that he had not felt it in a very long time. Late in the evening, when the crowd had thinned somewhat and the music had slowed to a waltz tempo, Walter stood beside Hazel in the barn doorway looking out at the dark Millhaven street, and she was close enough that he could feel the warmth from her arm, and she said quietly, "Walter, what is it that you carry?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "There's something." She was not looking at him but at the street, which gave her words a particular thoughtfulness. "You have a heaviness about you that doesn't fit the rest of you. The rest of you is kind and honest and present, but there's something underneath that you haven't spoken about." He was silent for a long moment. The fiddle played behind them. "There is something," he said at last. It was the most honest thing he had said in 5 years. She turned and looked at him then, and her amber eyes in the warm lantern light from the barn were serious and without judgment, waiting. "I'll tell you," he said. "I will, when I've found the right words for it." She looked at him a moment longer, searching, and then she nodded once. "All right," she said, "when you're ready." And then, in a gesture so simple it reduced him nearly to silence, she placed her hand briefly on his arm before she turned back to watch the street. He spent 2 weeks after that constructing the right words. He dismantled and rebuilt the speech in his mind 100 times, out in the heat of his fields and in the quiet of his almost finished house, and in the long evenings when the prairie went dark and the stars came out so thick above the Panhandle that they seemed to be pressing down. He knew what the truth was. He knew what it required. He knew that telling it might end everything that was growing between him and Hazel Hale, and he knew that not telling it would also, eventually, end everything, because a love built on concealment is not a love at all but only a hope wrapped in deception. The stone beneath his ribs had not merely shifted now. It had begun to grind. The situation came to a head in a way he had not anticipated. It was the 3rd week of July, and he was in town picking up supplies, when he encountered at the north end of Main Street a man he recognized immediately and profoundly. Gorton, the attorney. The pale, slick-haired man who had waved that fabricated survey document on the morning of the Hale eviction was now apparently established in Millhaven, operating an office 2 doors down from the bank, a modest shingle outside reading Gorton and Associates, Land and Property Law. Walter stopped on the boardwalk and looked at the shingle for a long moment. Then he went to the general store. He found Hazel behind the counter and Cornelius in the back, and he said to Hazel in a low voice, "Do you know that Gorton has an office on Main Street? Gorton who drew up the fraudulent survey document against your father's claim." Hazel's expression tightened in a way that made her look very like the 17-year-old on those porch steps. "Yes," she said. "He moved here 6 months ago. My father knows. There's nothing to be done about it." "There might be," Walter said, and he said it with a certainty that came from somewhere he hadn't accessed in 5 years, a place in himself where the man he ought to have been had been waiting, patient and still. Hazel looked at him very carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that the original land office filing your father made should still exist in Amarillo. Government records of that kind don't disappear. And if the original filing stands and there's a witness who was present and can testify to the nature of the eviction, the fraudulence of the counter document might be demonstrable even now. A witness, Hazel said slowly. Yes. The word sat between them like a stone dropped on still water, and Hazel looked at him with her measuring, careful gaze, and Walter thought she had understood something, some corner of the truth, but she said only, "Do you know of such a witness, Walter?" "I might," he said, and held her gaze when he said it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you and I need to have that conversation you said you'd have when you found the right words." "Yes," he said, "I think we do." They could not have it in the store, in earshot of her father, because Walter was not certain how Cornelius would respond to what he had to say, and he needed to tell Hazel first. He needed her to understand before anyone else did. He asked if she would come out to his property that Sunday afternoon, and she said she would, and he spent the intervening days in a state of clarity and dread combined that was not unlike what he imagined soldiers felt before a battle they had chosen to face. Sunday came with a dry, hot wind from the southwest that bent the creek grass and filled the air with fine dust. Hazel arrived in a small buggy she had borrowed from Pearl Simmons, driving it herself with the competence of a woman who had learned practical skills from a young age. And she tied the horse at the post Walter had put in near the creek and walked up to the house with her chin level and her eyes clear. He brought out 2 chairs, and they sat on the narrow front porch that he had only just finished boarding, and Walter looked out at the land he had come to, the creek moving in the afternoon light, the grass bending in the wind, and he told her everything. He began in the spring of 1878. He told her who he was then, a 24-year-old ranch hand working for Silas Drummond. He told her about riding out with Drummond's party under the pretense of checking fence lines. He told her about arriving at the Hale homestead, which she did not yet know was this land, this very land they were sitting on. He told her about watching Gorton wave the fraudulent document, about watching her father's papers get torn from his hands, about watching Clara scream from the doorway and Cornelius get his arm wrenched back by Drummond's men. And he told her he had said nothing. He had sat his horse 30 yards back and watched it happen and ridden home afterward and spent 5 years not speaking of it. He told her all of this steadily and completely, and he looked at the creek while he spoke rather than at her, because he was not willing to hide his face, but he was also not willing to use her reaction as a measure of how much he should reveal. He told the entire truth because it deserved to be told, not parceled out into the amount that would make him look most favorably. When he finished, the only sounds were the wind in the grass and the creek water moving below. He turned and looked at her then. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and her face was doing something complicated and layered that he could not fully read. There was anger in it. There was pain. There was something else too, something that he could not yet name. "You were one of those men," she said, not a question. "Yes." I looked at all of them that morning. She was still looking at the distance. I tried to memorize every face. I was at the back. "I know," she paused. "I didn't remember you, not until just now. But now that you've told me, there's something familiar." She turned and looked at him directly, and the amber eyes were very serious. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want to be the kind of man who tells the truth. And because seeing Gorton's name on that shingle was the thing that finally made me understand that staying silent doesn't protect me. It only protects men like Drummond and Gorton." She was quiet for another long moment. "And because of me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was simply a statement of what she had understood. "Yes," he said. "Primarily because of you, because I could not build something real with you while this was the foundation." She stood up from her chair and walked to the edge of the porch and put her hands on the railing and looked out at the creek that had once been the border of her childhood home. The wind moved her hair. Walter sat very still and waited. "My father built a barn here," she said, "just to the left of where your barn is now. He was so proud of it. He had never owned land before in his life, and he talked about this creek like it was something God had specifically arranged for him. She paused. My mother planted a kitchen garden in the fall before we were taken. She never got to see what came up. I'm sorry, Walter said, and the inadequacy of the words was the same as always, but he said them anyway because they were the truest thing he had. She stood at the railing for a long time. He did not speak. He had learned, in 5 years of his own silence and in the weeks of listening to Hazel, that some moments required only waiting and not filling. Finally she turned around, and her face had settled into something that was not exactly forgiveness, and was not exactly anger, but was something more complicated and more honest than either. You were 24 years old, she said. You were working for a man who had the county law in his pocket. I'm not saying what you did was right. I am saying that you have lived with it and you chose to live with it in a particular way. You could have let it keep you silent. A lot of men would have. He did not let himself be absolved by this. I let it keep me silent for 5 years, he said, and now you're not silent. She came back to her chair and sat down. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. What do you want to do about it? I want to go to Amarillo, he said. I want to go to the land office and pull the original filing your father made, and then I want to find the county court records for the survey document Gorton filed, and then I want to give a sworn testimony about what I witnessed. She looked at him with those amber eyes that saw everything. The land itself is gone, she said carefully. It's been sold twice over. Even if the original claim is proven, we won't get this land back. I know, he said. But Gorton is practicing law in Millhaven right now. He is in a position to do this to other families. And Drummond, wherever he is, has never been held to account. He paused. Maybe the claim can't be restored. But the record can be corrected, and Gorton can be held to answer for what he did. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You would do this. You know it will cost you. You'll be known as the man who testified against Drummond's operation. You'll make enemies. I should have made those enemies 5 years ago, Walter said. A silence opened between them, and in it something shifted in the atmosphere, the way the air shifts before a change in weather, some fundamental pressure adjusting. I'll need to tell my father, Hazel said at last. He'll need to know the whole of it, including about you. I know. He may not receive it as calmly as I have. I know that too. Walter met her eyes. I'm not asking you to protect me from his reaction, Hazel. Whatever he decides about me, he's entitled to. She looked at him for a long, measured moment, and something in what she saw seemed to satisfy some internal question she had been asking. I'm not angry with you, she said, with a precision that told him she had examined this statement carefully before speaking it. I'm not saying what you did was right because it wasn't, but I understand it. And what you're doing now matters. She paused. To me, it matters. He held her gaze and felt something in his chest that was completely unlike the stone that had lived there for 5 years. It was the opposite of the stone. It was something expanding rather than contracting, something that moved toward rather than away. Hazel, he said, and her name in his mouth felt like the most consequential word he had ever spoken. Don't say anything else right now, she said, but she said it gently, and the slight lift at the corner of her mouth was there again. Let's handle one thing at a time. They went to see Cornelius Hale that evening. Walter had been afraid of this conversation, in the way that men are afraid of consequences they've earned but haven't faced, with the particular dread of the accountable. Cornelius Hale received them in the small sitting room of his house, where he was reading a newspaper by lamplight, and he folded the paper when they came in and looked at Walter with the quiet patience of a man who has been surprised by the world enough times to wait and see what form the next surprise will take. Hazel sat beside her father and Walter sat across from them both, and he told the whole of it again, beginning to end, in the same steady, complete way he had told Hazel on the porch, because the truth was the same truth and deserved to be told the same way regardless of the audience. Cornelius Hale was very still throughout the telling. His broad hands lay flat on his thighs and his eyes were on Walter's face with an expression that Walter could not decipher and did not try to. When Walter finished, Cornelius was silent for a long time. "You rode with Drummond's men that morning," Cornelius said at last. "Yes, sir." "As a hired hand?" "Yes, sir." "Not as one of the men who put hands on me?" "No, sir, I stayed back. I did not participate in what happened to you physically. But I witnessed it, and I did not intervene, and I did not speak of it afterward, and those failures are mine." Cornelius looked at his hands. He breathed. The lamp burned between them. "My wife is buried in Millhaven Cemetery," Cornelius said, with a quietness that carried more weight than anger would have. "We moved here because we had nowhere else to go after Drummond took that land. Clara got sick in the autumn of 1881 and she died, and I have sometimes wondered whether she would have been stronger to fight it off if she had not spent 3 years running and starting over." He looked up from his hands. "I cannot answer that. No one can." "No, sir," Walter said, and he did not flinch from the implication. Another silence. "What do you intend to do?" Cornelius asked. "Ride to Amarillo and pull the original filing from the land office records," Walter said. "Get a sworn statement about what I witnessed. Bring it to whatever legal authority has jurisdiction over Gorton's conduct, whether that's the State Bar Association or the county courts. I believe his license to practice law may be challengeable on the basis of fraudulent document filing." Cornelius looked at him for a long moment. "That attorney is still here," he said. "Gorton?" "Yes, sir. That's part of why I decided it was time." "And if you do this, what do you want in return?" Cornelius asked, and it was a fair question from a man who had learned to recognize the shape of people's motives. "Nothing from you," Walter said. "What I want," he paused and looked at Hazel briefly, and then back at Cornelius. "What I want from your daughter is something I have no right to ask for until I've done what I should have done 5 years ago. And even after that, it's her decision." Hazel was looking at him with those clear amber eyes, and she said nothing, but the look said enough. Cornelius Hale studied Walter Langston for a long, slow, searching time. He was reading the man the way a farmer reads weather, looking for the signs of what was coming. "You'll take a letter from me," Cornelius said at last, "to the land office. I still have a copy of the original filing. It's been sitting in the bottom of my trunk for 5 years. I never threw it away." There was something in his voice when he said that, not quite grief and not quite defiance, but the exact tone of a man who has kept a thing because throwing it away would have meant admitting that it was over, and he was not that kind of man. "You'll take my letter and my copy and your testimony and you'll go to Amarillo." "Yes, sir." "And when you come back," Cornelius said, "we will sit again and I will tell you what I think of you." He paused. "Not before." Walter rode to Amarillo 6 days later, at the end of July 1883, with Cornelius Hale's letter and the copy of the original homestead filing in his saddlebag, alongside a written account of his own witness testimony that he had composed at his kitchen table over the course of 3 evenings, writing and rewriting, until it was as complete and accurate as memory and honesty together could make it. Hazel saw him off at the edge of town early on a Tuesday morning, the sun barely up, the road stretching pale and straight ahead of him. "Be careful," she said, standing in the road with her arms crossed against the morning cool. "I'll be back within the week," he said. "I know you will." She looked up at him on his horse with a steadiness that was entirely her own. "Walter." She said his name the way he had heard her say it in his head 100 times, with a weight that meant something. "I'm glad you told me." He looked down at her from the saddle. The morning light was doing that thing again, the particular thing it did with her, finding her face in the way light finds the things that deserve it. "So am I," he said. He rode north through the Panhandle with the sun rising over the flat land. And for the first time in 5 years, the stone beneath his ribs was not a stone at all, but simply the weight of something important. And important things, he was learning, were not the same as burdens. The land office in Amarillo was a government building on a side street that smelled of paper and ink, presided over by a meticulous young clerk named Archer who had been in the job 4 years, and took bureaucratic accuracy seriously in the manner of men who find genuine satisfaction in order. Walter presented the Hale copy of the original filing and asked whether the original record could be located. Archer spent the better part of an afternoon in the filing cabinets and produced, ultimately, the original stamped document with the land office seal, which matched the copy Cornelius had kept in his trunk exactly. Walter sat down with Archer and went through the documentation step by step. The original filing was unambiguously valid. The counter-document that Gorton had filed, a copy of which existed in the county court records, and which Walter had taken the step of telegraphing the county clerk in Colton to request, showed specific discrepancies in its survey points that conflicted with both the original filing and the known geographic features of the land as established by the original government survey of the area. These were not small errors. They were the kind of discrepancies that could only have been produced by deliberate falsification. Archer, who was more than a meticulous clerk, and was in fact a man with a strong professional commitment to the integrity of the land office records, listened to all of this with growing alarm and wrote a careful official report, which he signed with his own name and filed in the records, and which created a permanent notation attached to the Hale filing. Walter also visited the office of the U.S. Attorney in Amarillo, where a tired but competent man named Devereaux took Walter's written testimony and reviewed the filing documentation, and said that, while the statute of limitations on certain aspects of the fraud claim were complicated, the question of Gorton's fitness to practice law on the basis of a documented fraudulent document filing was very much a live matter and would be referred to the State Bar of Texas for examination. Walter was back in Millhaven on Friday evening, 5 days after he had ridden out, and he went first to the Hale house rather than to his own property. Cornelius was in the sitting room again, and Hazel was at the kitchen table writing something in a ledger she brought home from the store, and when Walter came through the door with his hat in his hand and his saddlebag still on his shoulder, Hazel looked up, and whatever she saw in his face told her enough, because she stood up from the table. He told them both what had happened in Amarillo. He laid the documentation on the table, the certified copy of the land office notation, the letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirming the referral to the State Bar, the official record of Archer's report. Cornelius Hale sat with the papers in his large hands and read each one slowly and carefully, and when he finished, he set them down on the table and was quiet for a long time. "The land is gone," Cornelius said at last. "Yes, sir. The legal title has changed hands twice since Drummond. What I could get was the correction of the record and the referral of Gorton's conduct." "Gorton may lose his license," Hazel said. "He may. It's the bar's decision. But there is now a formal record that the original Hale filing was valid and the counter-document was fraudulent." Cornelius looked down at the papers again. "Clara would have wanted this," he said quietly. "She never stopped being angry about those papers being torn out of my hands. She said it wasn't the land so much as the papers. The government had stamped those papers. It meant they'd said we belonged somewhere." He touched the edge of the certified copy. "This doesn't give us the land, but it says we were right." "You were right," Walter said. "You always were." Cornelius looked at him for a long moment, and Walter held the gaze and did not look away, because this was the accounting he'd been owing for 5 years and he was not going to flinch from it now. "You were a young man," Cornelius said at last, and his voice was careful and deliberate. "You were working for a powerful man and you were afraid of the consequences. I understand that. I do not say it was right, but I understand it." He picked up the certified copy of the land office notation and held it for a moment. "And now you are not afraid of those consequences?" "No, sir." Cornelius Hale nodded once. "Then we are square, you and I," he said. "Not because I've forgotten what you didn't do, but because of what you have done." He looked at his daughter and then back at Walter. "She told me what she's thinking," he said, with the slight gruffness of a father who has accepted something he wasn't entirely prepared for. "I'll not stand in the way of it." The weight of 5 years did not vanish in that moment. The stone was not simply unmade, but it became something different, something that had been transformed by being brought into the light and examined and worked with, the way raw stone is worked by a mason into something that can bear weight rather than merely be burdened by it. Walter looked at Hazel. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her amber eyes clear and bright in the lamplight, and she looked like what she was, a woman who had survived the worst and come out of it whole and fierce and capable of this, of standing in a room with the complicated truth and choosing it anyway. "Hazel," he said. "Yes," she said before he finished. He blinked. "I hadn't asked anything yet. You were going to." "I was." "The answer is yes," she said, and the slight lift at the corner of her mouth was the largest smile he had ever seen because it was the one that meant everything. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his, and they stood facing each other with Cornelius tactfully examining the documents on the table and pretending with great dignity not to be watching, and Walter said, "I love you, Hazel Hale. I know I've been the longest way around to saying it." "You have been," she agreed, but she was smiling fully now, entirely and without reservation, and it was the same full laugh he had seen in the street 6 weeks ago, only closer, only his, and it rearranged everything. He kissed her right there in her father's kitchen, which was not the most conventional of settings but was exactly right, because it was honest and unperformed and entirely them. And when he pulled back, she was still smiling and her amber eyes were brilliant with it. Cornelius cleared his throat with pointed courtesy. "Sit down," he said, without looking up from the papers. "Both of you, I'll make coffee." They were married on the 14th of September, 1883, in the Methodist Church in Millhaven, where Hazel had been attending services since she and her father moved to town. It was a clear, bright, golden light September day, the kind that the Texas Panhandle produces like a gift at the end of summer, when the brutal heat relents, and the sky takes on a depth and blue that makes the heart expand. Walter stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that he had purchased from the dry goods store in Millhaven, and had taken to a tailor in Amarillo on his most recent trip there. And he watched Hazel walk down the aisle on her father's arm with the sensation of a man who cannot quite believe the present moment is not a dream, but is prepared to receive it either way. She wore a cream dress with lace at the throat and her dark hair piled high with small white flowers threaded through it, and her amber eyes found his the moment she came through the church door and did not leave his face the entire length of the aisle. And Walter Langston, who had been quiet for 5 years and careful for longer, felt his throat tighten with something entirely good. Cornelius gave her hand to Walter with a gravity that was also, beneath its surface, unmistakably proud, and he took his place in the front pew with Pearl Simmons and her husband Amos beside him. And the minister began, and Walter and Hazel Hale stood face to face in the golden September morning, and made their promises to each other with the particular solemnity of people who do not make promises lightly. After the ceremony, the entire congregation of Millhaven Methodist, which was a good proportion of the town, spilled out into the churchyard where trestle tables had been set up and covered with food that half the town's women had contributed, and the fiddle player Macready was there again with his guitar backing musicians. And the afternoon became a celebration that went past sunset and into the early dark, with laughter and music and the ordinary extraordinary happiness of a community marking something that deserved to be marked. At some point in the early evening, Walter found himself sitting beside Cornelius at the edge of the celebration, both of them with cups of good whiskey that Amos Simmons had produced from somewhere, and Cornelius said, without particular prelude, "She's like her mother. Clara never let anything stop her from being herself, even when it cost her." "I know," Walter said. "I'm learning that already." Cornelius made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "You'll keep learning it. That's the nature of the thing." He looked at his daughter across the churchyard, where she was dancing with Pearl Simmons and laughing at something. "She's happy," he said, with a quiet satisfaction that needed no more words than that. "She is," Walter said. "So am I." They moved out to the Sweetwater Creek property that weekend, Hazel bringing her belongings in 2 trunks and a collection of kitchen items that Cornelius pressed on her with the practical love of a parent who expresses feeling through useful gifts. The small house that Walter had built received her as though it had been built for her specifically, which in the deeper sense it had, and she immediately began making it into something more than a shelter. Curtains she sewed herself in the first week, a kitchen garden mapped out along the south wall, opinions about where the furniture should stand that were delivered with the confident authority of a woman who knows what she wants. Walter found all of this profoundly good. The house he had built alone with its silences and its stone weight became, with Hazel in it, full of warmth and argument and the particular music of 2 people's lives overlapping. She brought her father's ledger methods to the household accounts and made Walter's rough financial notes into an organized record within a week. And she had thoughts about expanding the small herd, and about the price of wheat futures, and about which neighboring farmers might be interested in a cooperative arrangement for shared equipment. And Walter listened to all of these thoughts and implemented most of them and argued productively about the rest. He was, he discovered, not merely in love with her but continuously interested in her, which he had been told by an older man on the cattle drive in 1880 was the more durable and important of the two, and the older man had been right. Hazel was interesting every day. She surprised him with an idea or an observation or a completely unexpected angle on a thing he thought he understood, and it never got old. The matter of Gorton was resolved, though not as swiftly as dramatic satisfaction would have preferred. In November of 1883, 4 months after Walter's visit to Amarillo, word came back through the U.S. Attorney's Office that the State Bar of Texas had completed its examination of the fraudulent document filing and had revoked Ezra Gorton's license to practice law in the state. The ruling cited deliberate falsification of a government survey document for the purpose of facilitating an unlawful land dispossession. Gorton packed his modest Millhaven office and left town without fanfare, and no one Walter spoke to felt any particular sympathy about this. Walter told Hazel the news on the evening it arrived, sitting with her on the porch in the November cool with a lamp burning in the window behind them. She received it quietly, the way she received most things of consequence, with a stillness that was not absence of feeling but depth of it. "My father will want to know," she said. "I'll ride in tomorrow and tell him." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek in the gathering dark. "It doesn't bring back what we had," she said. "It doesn't bring back my mother's kitchen garden or my father's barn." "No," Walter said, "it doesn't. But it matters anyway." She turned and looked at him, and in the lamplight from the window her face was clear and steady. "It matters because it's the truth, because the record is correct now, because Gorton can't do it to another family. That's why I did it," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had been doing for 2 months now with the ease of a woman who has found the place in the world where she fits, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the November cool with the creek running quiet in the dark and the lamp warm behind them, and neither of them spoke for a while, because what was between them had moved past the need for constant words. In the spring of 1884, Hazel found that she was expecting their first child. She told Walter early on a March morning while he was getting ready to go out to the fields, and he stood absolutely still for a moment, and then turned and looked at her standing in the kitchen with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes full of a quiet shining. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and held it with a care that was complete and wordless. And then he said, in a voice that was not as steady as usual, "That is the best thing you have ever told me." "It is fairly good news," she agreed, and then laughed, that full open laugh that had undone him in the street 16 months ago and went on undoing him every day. He rode into Millhaven that afternoon and told Cornelius, who stood behind his store counter, and went very still for a moment, and then sat down on the stool behind the counter, and pressed his hand over his mouth, and said nothing for a long enough time that Walter became slightly concerned, until he realized the old man was not in distress, but was simply overwhelmed by something that he was not prepared to receive standing up. "Clara wanted grandchildren more than nearly anything," Cornelius said at last. "It's the one thing that." He stopped, pressed his hand over his mouth again. Walter let him be, because he had learned from Hazel that the things that mattered deserved the space to be felt. "She would have been very happy," Walter said quietly. "She would have been beside herself," Cornelius corrected, with a sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but was something in between that was its own honest thing. The summer of 1884 was hot and dry across the Panhandle, the kind of summer that tested farmers' resolve and rewarded those who had prepared their irrigation well. Walter had spent the spring clearing a proper water channel from the creek to his kitchen garden, and to the small wheat field he was developing on the south 40 acres, and the preparation paid off through the dry weeks of July and August, when neighbors who had not prepared lost portions of their crops to the drought. Hazel managed the household through the increasingly demanding months of her pregnancy with the same competent self-direction she brought to everything, though she accepted, on Walter's repeated and finally successful urging, that she would reduce her hours at the store to 3 days a week in August and September. She maintained that she was perfectly capable of her full schedule, which was true, but she conceded the reduction with the grace of a woman who understands that accepting help is not the same as conceding weakness. Pearl Simmons came out from town twice a week to sit with her and sew, and their conversations drifted through the windows to where Walter worked outside, a weave of gossip and news and genuine friendship that was its own complete world, and he was glad of it. In late September of 1884, 3 days before her due date, which the midwife had estimated with the general approximation that was the medical precision of the time, Hazel woke Walter in the middle of the night to tell him that it was time. Walter rode to town for the midwife, a solid, experienced woman named Mrs. Calloway who had attended births in Colton County for 15 years, in the fastest time he had ever covered that road. He also stopped at Cornelius's house and banged on the door until the old man appeared in his nightclothes, still more awake than his attire suggested, because he had been sleeping very lightly for the past week in anticipation of exactly this summons. Cornelius arrived at the Sweetwater Creek house in his wagon 20 minutes behind Mrs. Calloway and Walter, and he sat in the kitchen with Walter through the small hours of the night, drinking the coffee that Walter kept making more of because having something to do was the only viable strategy for managing the waiting. At dawn, as the first light began to spread over the creek and the grass, Mrs. Calloway came to the kitchen doorway with the competent and satisfied expression of a woman for whom this was the best possible outcome of a long night's work. "A boy," she said, "healthy and loud. Mrs. Langston is well." Walter stood up from the kitchen table so fast he nearly knocked his chair over. Cornelius reached across and put his hand over Walter's arm for a moment, a brief firm grip, and his eyes were bright in the morning light. Walter went in to Hazel. She was propped against the pillows with her dark hair loose, and the kind of exhaustion on her face that is not weakness but the visible mark of something great having been done, and she was holding a small, red-faced, indignant bundle who was indeed, as Mrs. Calloway had reported, making his presence known at considerable volume. She looked up when Walter came in, tired and bright-eyed and completely herself, the amber eyes full. "Come see your son," she said. Walter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this small person with his crumpled face and his miniature fists and his enormous outrage at the world, and felt something so large and specific that it had no adequate name, only the weight of it, which was nothing like the stone that had once lived in his chest but everything like its opposite. "He's extraordinary," Walter said. "He's rather loud," Hazel said, but she was looking at the child with the look of a woman who has found the thing she did not know she was missing until it arrived. "That seems like a good sign," Walter said. "It seems like your trait," she said, which made no sense whatsoever since Walter was one of the quieter men she had ever known, and they both knew it, and she laughed at her own joke in a way that crinkled the exhaustion on her face into something purely happy. They named him Clarence, for no particular reason except that the name suited him, and a middle name of James for Walter's own father, who had died when Walter was 19, and who had been, by Walter's account, a genuinely good man. Clarence James Langston grew, as babies do, with a velocity that seemed unreasonable in the early months. He was loud and determined and physically robust, and by the following spring he was pulling himself to standing against the furniture and regarding the world with an expression of focused assessment that was pure Hazel. He had her eyes exactly, the amber clarity of them, though his hair came in the dark brown that Walter carried, and the combination was devastating in the way that children tend to devastate their parents by being more themselves than anything the parents had expected. Cornelius was at the house on the creek at least twice a week. He was in his 50s now, moving more slowly but mentally sharp, and he had finally completed the purchase of a half-share in the general store from old Fletch, who had been making his noises about selling for 3 years and had finally reached the point of action. The partnership had given Cornelius a renewed engagement with the work, a sense of ownership that went beyond his wages, and Walter and Hazel both observed with quiet satisfaction that it had done him good. The spring of 1885 brought more settlers into Colton County, the ongoing wave of homesteaders moving west and north along the rail lines, and with them came the complications that population growth always brings. Disputes over water rights, questions about road access, the occasional sharp-elbowed competition for resources that was the perpetual texture of frontier life. Walter found himself called on twice in the spring of 1885 by neighboring homesteaders who had heard something of his Amarillo journey and the Gorton affair, people who wanted advice about their own claims and their own documents. He helped them navigate the land office records and the county clerk's office with the practical knowledge he had acquired, and more than once he rode to Amarillo himself on another family's behalf to verify a filing or request an official copy of a record. He had no legal training and did not pretend to any, but what he had was the particular usefulness of a man who had learned from his own worst moment and was prepared to be thorough on behalf of someone else. Hazel watched this development with the thoughtful attention she brought to all of Walter's actions, and one evening in May, when Clarence was asleep and the porch held the warm last light of a long spring day, she said to him, "You've become something of a land rights advocate." "I've become a man who knows which drawers the records are in," he said. "That's often the most useful thing to be." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. "There's a family out on the north edge of the county. Name of Rays. They filed a proper homestead claim 18 months ago, and someone is disputing the eastern boundary with a document that doesn't look right. Pearl told me about them." Walter looked at her. "What kind of document?" "Survey document," Hazel said, "filed with the county court. The eastern boundary points don't match the original government survey of the area." She paused, and her amber eyes met his with a directness that carried 5 years of history in it. "It sounds familiar." Walter was quiet for a moment. "It does. I thought you might want to ride out and speak with them." "I'll go tomorrow," he said. "I know you will," she said, and there was that look again, the one that said she knew exactly who he was and had chosen it fully. "I'll pack you a lunch." The situation with the Rays family turned out to be a straightforward case of a land speculator, named Hollies, attempting the same basic fraud that Drummond and Gorton had employed on the Hale claim in 1878, with slightly less sophisticated execution. Walter identified the survey document discrepancies within a day of examining the county court records, and he and Antonio Rays rode to Amarillo together in June, and the matter was resolved in the Rays family's favor within a month, the county court dismissing Hollies' document as insufficiently supported and the Rays boundary being confirmed. Antonio Rays was a compact, dignified man of Mexican heritage in his mid-30s who had come to Texas from New Mexico Territory with his wife Alina and their 3 children, and who shook Walter's hand at the end of the Amarillo proceeding with a solemnity that said more than any formal thanks. "You didn't have to do this," Antonio said. "I've been in debt to someone who needed it done sooner than I did it," Walter said. "I'm still working on the interest." Antonio looked at him for a moment with the eyes of a man who understands the long arithmetic of moral obligation without needing the specifics explained. "Come to supper," he said. "Alina will cook. You can bring your family." They did come to supper, all 3 of them, Walter and Hazel and Clarence, who had recently begun walking and was exercising this new capability with the enthusiasm of a person who has discovered the best possible invention. And the evening at the raised table was warm and full, and the kind of good that happens when people who have been through hard things choose to sit together in the ordinary comfort of a shared meal. The autumn of 1885 brought the news that Silas Drummond had died. It came through the Millhaven telegraph office in October, relayed from a notice in an Amarillo newspaper. Drummond had been 61 years old and had spent his last 2 years in reduced circumstances following the cattle die-offs of 1882 and the gradual erosion of his land holdings as various debts and legal settlements chipped away at his empire. He had died, the notice said, at his remaining property east of Amarillo, with no family present. Walter read the telegraph notice in Millhaven and stood with it in his hand for a moment in the afternoon street. He felt something that was not quite grief and was not quite satisfaction, but was the particular feeling of an account finally closed, not resolved in any complete moral sense, because the dead do not make restitution, but simply closed. He told Hazel that evening. She sat with it for a while. "I don't feel sorry for him," she said at last honestly. "I know I perhaps should, but I don't." "You're not required to," Walter said. "My mother might have forgiven him," Hazel said. "She was built that way. I'm more like my father. We forgive things because it's right and because it frees us, but we don't require ourselves to feel what isn't there." She paused. "I hope he thought about what he did. I hope there was some accounting in him before the end, but whether there was or wasn't, it's done." "Yes," Walter said, "it is." She leaned her head against his shoulder on the porch, where they had established the habit of sitting in the evenings when Clarence was in bed and the day was done, and the creek ran in the dark below them, and Walter put his arm around her, and the October air was cool and clean. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was a hard one, the kind the Panhandle periodic produced with a thoroughness that reminded settlers of the conditions they were working within. Walter had put by enough hay and grain through the summer to keep his small herd through the cold months, and the house was well chinked and warm, and they spent the long dark evenings in the particular domesticity of a household that had found its rhythm. Hazel reading or sewing or working through the household accounts, while Walter mended harness or read the newspaper she had sent out from town, or, increasingly, helped Clarence learn to recognize letters, which the 2-year-old approached with intense seriousness. They argued sometimes. Hazel had strong opinions, as Walter had known from the beginning, and so did Walter in his quiet way, and occasionally those strong opinions ran in different directions and required the friction and negotiation of genuine partnership rather than deference. She wanted to expand the wheat field, and he was cautious about the investment given the uncertain commodity prices. He wanted to add a second room to the house, and she had a different opinion about the layout. They worked through these differences in the manner of people who respect each other enough to argue properly, which is to say with full engagement and without contempt, and arrived at decisions that were usually better than either individual position had been. They were, in the truest sense, building something, not merely a house or a farm, but a life that had the specific shape and density of 2 people's intentions combined. In the spring of 1887, Hazel told him she was expecting again. She told him over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with the same direct simplicity she brought to all her communications, and Walter looked across the table at her with that same wordless care he had shown her the first time, and she smiled at him with the full open smile that 3.5 years of marriage had made no less extraordinary. This time she was not uncertain about her health or the process. She was simply matter-of-fact about it, confident in her body's knowledge, present with it rather than anxious, and Walter followed her lead and was matter-of-fact about it too, while privately feeling it in the expanded way he had felt it the first time. She rode into town to tell her father herself, driving the small buggy, and came home reporting that Cornelius had sat down on his store stool again, which had apparently become his specific response to the best news, and then had immediately begun making a list of things the baby would need that he intended to provide. The baby was born in October of 1887, a girl this time, red-faced and immediately vocal like her brother, though with an addition to the volume that suggested she had noted her brother's precedent and intended to exceed it. They named her Lillian Clara, the second name for the grandmother she would not know except through the stories that Cornelius and Hazel and Walter would tell her. Clarence, who was 3.5 and had developed firm opinions about his position in the household, received his sister with a guardedness that lasted approximately 2 days before converting to a fierce and proprietary devotion that expressed itself primarily in his insistence on being present whenever anyone else approached the baby. Walter watched his son hovering over the cradle one evening with the serious intensity of a small person, taking on a responsibility he had not been assigned, but had decided was his, and felt something so complete in his chest that he had to look away from it for a moment, because it was almost too large to contain. Cornelius was at the house the morning after Lillian Clara's birth, having received Walter's pre-dawn summons, and he held his second grandchild with the practiced ease of a man who has done this before and the fresh awe of a man for whom the miracle has not diminished. He was 59 years old and his hair was entirely white now, and he moved with the deliberate care of age, but his eyes were the same, the quiet dignity of a man who has been knocked down and refused to stay there. 2, he said, looking up at Walter over the baby's head. 2, Walter agreed. Clara would have wanted a dozen, Cornelius said, with the particular combination of grief and amusement that is the texture of long love remembered. The spring of 1888 brought something Walter had not expected, an approach from a newly formed county organization that was working to establish clearer legal protections for homestead claims in Colton County, drawing on the experience of the land abuses of the past decade, and lobbying the state legislature for strengthened statutes. They asked Walter to join the organization's advisory group on the basis of his known work on land documentation and his history with the Hale case and the Rays case. He sat with this for a week before answering. Then he talked it through with Hazel on the porch in the April evening while Clarence played in the yard in the long western light and Lillian Clara slept inside. "It will take time," Hazel said. She was not objecting, simply noting the reality. "It will. Time that could go to the farm." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Do it," she said. "The farm is doing well enough. This is the other kind of work, the kind that takes longer and matters further out." He looked at her. "You'd be taking on more at the farm." "I'm already taking on plenty at the farm," she said with the slight sharpness of a woman who has never given less than full effort to anything she's done. "I'm not made of glass, Walter. I know what I can carry." He knew that better than anyone. "All right," he said. "All right," she echoed, and then called to Clarence to come in because the light was failing, which Clarence ignored with the thoroughness of a 3-year-old engaged in an activity of great personal importance. Walter joined the Colton County Homestead Protection Association, which was its formal name, and spent portions of the following years working alongside its other members to draft petitions to the state legislature and to establish a reference office in Millhaven, where homesteaders could bring their documents for review. It was unglamorous work, heavy with paper and procedural patience, but it was the work of making the system more honest than it had been, And that was the kind of work that Walter Langston had discovered he was made for. The years rolled through with the particular speed that good years tend to have, as if happiness moves faster than suffering, which perhaps it does, or perhaps it simply makes better use of the time. The farm on the Sweetwater Creek grew steadily, the 60 acres expanding to 90 when the parcel to the north came available in 1889, and Walter purchased it. The wheat operation became genuinely profitable in the years when the rains came right, and in the dry years the cattle side carried the balance. And by 1891, they had a working farm that was comfortable and honest and built with their own hands and minds. Clarence started at the Millhaven School when he was 6, walking into his first day of formal education with the same focused assessment he brought to everything, and came home reporting on it with the completeness of a child for whom detail matters, which was pure Hazel. Lillian Clara followed 2 years later, and was, within her first week, the uncontested social epicenter of her classroom, which surprised no one who had observed her since birth. Cornelius Hale had a spell of illness in the winter of 1891, a chest ailment that alarmed everyone for a month before it resolved, leaving him somewhat thinner and moving more slowly but fundamentally himself, stubborn and dignified, and still opening the store 6 days a week. Hazel drove into Millhaven every day during that month, and Walter covered what needed covering at the farm without comment, because there was nothing to say. She needed to be with her father, and he needed her to be there. When Cornelius recovered, Walter drove them all out to the farm for Sunday dinner, and they sat around the table that Walter had built himself in the first year, the 4 adults and the 2 children, and the meal was simple and good, and the conversation moved through a dozen things and returned to laughter repeatedly, and Walter looked around that table at what he had been given and felt, as he sometimes did in moments like this, the particular gratitude of a man who knows specifically what he might have lost. He had almost stayed silent forever. The thought still visited him sometimes, not with the grinding weight of the old stone, but with a clarity that he had come to regard as useful. The memory of his cowardice was not something to be expelled, but something to be understood, because he had been given the chance to understand it in the particular way that comes only from having lived through its consequences and chosen differently on the other side. One evening in the summer of 1892, Hazel found him sitting on the porch as the sun went down, and she sat beside him in the chair that was hers by 11 years of habit, and after a moment she said, "What are you thinking about?" "The morning in 1878, he said. He still said it directly when it came up, because directness was what they owed each other. She looked at the creek. "What about it?" "I think about the version of myself that said nothing and went home and stayed silent forever," he said. "About what that man would be now." "He wouldn't be here," she said simply. "No," Walter said, "he wouldn't be anywhere worth being." Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have thought sometimes about what I would be if Drummond had not taken that land, whether we would have stayed on it and made it work and never moved to Millhaven." She paused. "I might never have met you." "You wouldn't have wanted to meet me if I'd stayed the other version," Walter said. "I met you after," she said. "I chose the version that chose differently." He turned and looked at her in the summer evening light, and she was looking at him with the amber eyes that had never stopped seeing him clearly, all of him, the good and the failed and the rebuilt, and the love in them was not in spite of all of it but including all of it, which was the only love that is real. "I love you, Hazel Langston," he said. "I love you, Walter," she said, and reached over and took his hand in both of hers, and they sat in the warm summer evening with the creek running below them, and the sound of their children's voices carrying from inside the house, where they were being supervised by Cornelius, who was telling them something that was producing a great deal of laughter from all 3 parties. And the land around them lay in the evening light in the full and particular beauty of a place that has been worked and loved and is flourishing. He had come back to this land because he thought building something honest on it might be a kind of restitution. He had not known then that what he would find here was not merely restitution, but everything. He had not known that the woman who had stood on those porch steps with her fists clenched and her eyes burning at all of Drummond's men would be the one who would find him at the back of that group with her clear gaze and hold him to what he could become. He had not known that loving her would require being honest, and that being honest would require being brave, and that being brave would require finally opening the door that had been nailed shut in him since that morning in the spring of 1878. But here was the thing he had learned, and it was the truest thing he knew. The stone had not killed him. He had carried it for 5 years, and it had not crushed him, and when he finally let it break open and looked at what was inside was everything that needed to be said. And saying it had not destroyed him or her or any of the love that was building between them. It had instead made the foundation honest, and an honest foundation holds. The creek ran on in the long summer evening. Somewhere to the south, a mockingbird was cataloging the world from the top of a cottonwood, running through its repertoire with the cheerful inexhaustibility of a creature that believes it has something important to say about everything. Cornelius's laughter and the children's laughter intertwined inside the house. Hazel's hands held Walter's with the easy completeness of years of choosing. In the spring of 1893, Hazel told Walter she was expecting their 3rd child, and he received this news in the kitchen on a March morning with the same wordless care and the same expansion in his chest that he had felt both times before, and she laughed at the expression on his face with the full open laugh that had never once stopped being his favorite sound in the world. The baby arrived in September, another boy, whom they named William Cornelius, the second name causing the old man to have to sit down at the kitchen table on the morning of the birth when Walter told him, and to stay sitting for some time while he was very quiet in the way that meant he was full. William Cornelius Langston grew into a person of enormous energy and specific enthusiasms, as different from his thoughtful older brother and his socially masterful older sister, as 3 children from the same parents can be, which is very different indeed. And the house on the Sweetwater Creek in the following years was a place of the particular productive chaos of 3 children being raised by 2 people who loved each other, and knew what they were doing and argued constructively about the parts they were uncertain of. Cornelius Hale lived to see all 3 of his grandchildren old enough to know him. He slowed in his late 60s, finally stepping back from the store in 1898 when he was 63, and he spent his last years more often at the farm than in Millhaven, occupying the room that Walter and Hazel had added to the house specifically for him. An addition that had been the occasion of one of their most productive arguments before arriving at a design they were both satisfied with. He died in the winter of 1900, peacefully in his room at the farm, with Hazel beside him and Clarence, who was 16 and already the kind of young man who understood what was asked of him in a moment like this, sitting on his other side. Walter stood in the doorway and watched his father-in-law go with the respect he had always felt for the man, the particular respect of someone who knows that dignity under unjust pressure is the truest form of strength. They buried Cornelius beside Clara in the Millhaven Cemetery on a January day with the sky flat and pale and the air cold and clean, and all of Millhaven came to the service, because Cornelius Hale had been in that town long enough and decently enough that his absence made a shape in the community, the way a good tree's absence makes a shape. At the graveside, Walter stood beside Hazel and held her hand in both of his, and she wept with the full, honest grief of a daughter who loved her father without complication, and he held her and did not try to minimize it or rush it, because grief like hers deserved its full time. She was stronger a week later, as he had known she would be, and a month later she was herself again in all the ways that mattered, though the loss lived in her in the quiet, permanent way that the loss of a parent does, visible in certain moments and integrated into all the others. The years that followed were good years, substantial and full. Clarence grew into a young man who studied agriculture and land law at a college in Austin, coming home for summers and bringing books and ideas that he and Walter argued about with the particular pleasure of a father and son who are genuinely intellectual equals. Lillian Clara became a schoolteacher in Millhaven at 20, moving back to town and establishing herself with the effortless social authority she had been practicing since the first grade. William, the youngest, had the farm in his blood most thoroughly of the three, and stayed on, learning the operation from the inside with the focused energy that had always been his hallmark. Walter turned 50 in 1904, and Hazel organized the birthday celebration with the thoroughness she brought to everything she organized, filling the farm with people and food and music. The fiddle player's son, who had inherited his father's position in the Colton County social calendar, playing the same tunes that Macready Sr. had played at the church picnic in 1883 when Walter first danced with Hazel. He stood in the middle of the party on his own land in the warm evening of his birthday, watching his wife move through the gathering with the warmth and directness that were completely and specifically hers, 22 years after he had first walked into a general store in Millhaven and seen her behind the counter weighing flour. And what he felt was exactly what he had felt in every good moment of the years between: the full, complete, specific recognition of the right life. Later, when the guests had gone home and the children, who were not children now but were still somehow always that in the particular vision of a parent's eyes, had helped clear the tables and retreated to their own corners of the evening, Walter and Hazel sat on the porch in the warm August dark, and the creek ran below them as it always had, and the stars were out across the Panhandle sky in the full extravagance that had always seemed like the land's compensation for everything else it demanded. 50 years old, Hazel said, with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth. "I know," he said. "I feel it occasionally. You don't look it. You're very kind." "I'm accurate," she said, which was exactly what she would say, and he loved her for it exactly. He took her hand in his, the way he had taken it 1,000 times, and she held it with the easy familiarity of 2 decades and more of choosing. And the Sweetwater Creek moved in the summer dark below the porch of the house he had built on the land she had once called home. And the land was good, and the years had been good, and the account that had seemed so impossible on that morning in 1878 had been paid in the only currency that matters: honesty and work and the specific, daily accumulated weight of love. He had been afraid to speak for 5 years. He had sat his horse in the spring of 1878 and said nothing while the worst thing happened, and the stone had settled into him, and he had carried it through 5 years of expiation that was really only silence wearing a different name. And then a woman with amber eyes and an iron jaw had walked into his peripheral vision, and by being exactly who she was, had made silence impossible. Not by demanding the truth from him, but by being the kind of person whose presence made dishonesty intolerable. She had not saved him in the way of a rescue, because she was not a woman who saved people by doing it for them. She had simply been herself, so completely and so clearly that he had been unable to remain the lesser version of himself in her vicinity. She had, without intending it and without knowing it until much later, made him into the man he had always been capable of being. And he had loved her for it every day since, and would love her for it in all the days that remained, which he intended there to be many of, here on this land by the Sweetwater Creek, where the grass bent in the Panhandle wind and the stars came out extravagant, and the mockingbird in the cottonwood said everything worth saying about the extraordinary fact of being alive in a place you have chosen and earned and loved into wholeness. The creek ran on. The stars burned. Hazel Langston held her husband's hand on the porch of the house that was theirs, on the land that was theirs, in the life that was entirely, irreversibly and beautifully theirs, and the stone was gone, and what remained in its place was everything that the stone had never been: warm and expanding and full of sound and light, and the particular grace of a love that had been built on truth and had held.